I'm in Minneapolis.
Oh, got
it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another AASPT Sports Performance live podcast, Casual Chat. Tonight, we are lucky enough to have Ken Knox. He's at Wake Forest. And Ken, I'm going to let you tell everyone about yourself a little bit more.
Thanks, Owen. So I am at Wake Forest. I got there in February 2021. I'm the Director of Sports Performance for our Olympic sports and then our Return to Performance Coordinator at Wake. Do you want me to go through a little bit of a background or just...
Yeah,
sure,
how'd you get there? I will say I did. This is somewhat entertaining. I was like, ooh, I'm going to Google Ken. And the first thing that pops up is this like musician, a blues musician named Ken Knox. Yes. Okay. You're a little bit farther down the scroll, but you are there. And we're both at University of Kentucky.
I did notice that.
Yeah.
Although we were ships in the night because you left right before I got there. I got there spring of 2021. And I believe that's when you left.
Yeah, pretty close. So I did notice that as well doing my research, but I did my undergrad at Emory and Henry College. It's Emory and Henry University now in Virginia. And I started there playing baseball and football, and I was an athletic training major and quickly realized the football and baseball route wasn't going to be for me. Knew I wasn't going to go play professionally anywhere, and athletic training was definitely a grind. And figuring out how to navigate that and how to manage all of my time was a little bit of a challenge. So I decided to give up both of those sports, and that was about the same time I found out that strength conditioning was a thing. So I was lucky enough to be able to do an internship my junior year at Emory, and again, lucky enough to be able to do a summer internship at the University of South Carolina and really immerse myself for strength conditioning. And that was where I kind of put two and two together that I want to finish this athletic training thing. I want to get this done and make sure I get my degree, but I think I want to go more of the sports performance or strength conditioning route. So I did the internship at Emory for the next year. I was thankful enough and fortunate enough to be able to get a volunteer internship at the University of Kentucky. And once we got there, we had the opportunity. We had two opportunities to get a paid internship for the year or a graduate assistantship. And again, super fortunate that I was able to get the graduate assistantship at Kentucky. So I was there for almost 3 years. I was able to get my master's paid for and got it in sport and exercise psychology, which was really interesting and a field that I was interested in. I just didn't get enough time in undergrad to go through. So that was nice. And then, like Megan said, I left February 2021. It was in the midst of COVID. It was definitely after. So we were back at work. Mm-hmm. We were doing some things, but we were definitely navigating that. And they were very supportive of making sure I applied to any job that interested me because my time at Kentucky was about to finish and they didn't want me to struggle getting a job or getting a position. And in February, I applied for Wake, and thankful they were willing to take a chance on me, and I've been there ever since.
Nice. At UK, question: who was your advisor at UK? Do you know?
Mark Cormier.
I don't know if I know who that is. I'm giving a bad look. Sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. I did see, I think you worked or work with Chris Morris?
Mm-hmm.
So that was the connection I was thinking that we would have. But
oh, nice.
I didn't get to work with him very much. He helped out on the Olympic side with women's soccer when we do anything testing wise. And we would go over to football, and that was where baseball would train. So I would see him pretty consistently. Plus my roommate at the time while I was in Kentucky, Tyler Linden, he worked very, very.
Oh, Tyler's still there as a strength and conditioning coach.
Really? No, I think that's Tyler Malone.
Tyler?
Yeah, I think that's Tyler Malone.
I'm just striking out on all fronts. I'm going to stop talking. We will.
PhD brain.
Tyler Linden, he also worked with Chris Morris. So
that name sounds really familiar.
He works for Teamworks now?
Yes. Okay. Yes, that's who that is. Okay. I'm back. I'm tracking.
It's only up from here.
Absolutely. So then when you landed at Wake, I'm assuming you didn't get hired as director of Olympic sports performance.
I did not. So at the time, I honestly, again, it was in the midst of COVID. So I really had no expectations. I wanted to take the next step. I didn't want to be unemployed, and I didn't really know what the next step was. So my supervisors were very supportive through that time, and just making sure each position I was looking at could be the right fit. And it was an assistant director position at Wake when I first applied. And me just coming out of grad school, I thought that was an awesome opportunity. And it was for teams that I had worked with. So it was meant to be volleyball, men's tennis, women's tennis when I initially got there. And I ended up transitioning or taking a little bit of a detour once I got there, where volleyball had their strength coach. They were kind of set in stone with what they had going. But I love assisting with all of our teams, and I still do it, but I love being steadily busy. So once I got there, I was assisting with all the teams that I could and working with men's and women's tennis directly. But I was able to work with field hockey when I initially got there, and I had never experienced them. So once I got there, I was able to work with field hockey full time. And then 2 years later, I had kind of started in this role of return to performance with the athletic training background. It was definitely an idea that they thought could be feasible. We just didn't know necessarily how it would come about, and we didn't know logistically how it would work out, if it was realistic. So our rehab coordinator, Sarah, and I would meet consistently on a weekly basis. We would chat about our PT patients, but that was pretty much the extent of it. I would report back to our staff and tell them, hey, here's what they're doing in rehab. Here's what they're doing with PT. Here's what they're doing with their athletic trainers. And here's what they can and can't do in the weight room. And that was the extent of it. And 2 years after I got to Wake, that was kind of when we formalized it to where I was then assistant director and return to performance coordinator. So that was a more formal transition. Title was nice, but it didn't really change much, because after that, it was just a matter of now, how do we figure out how do I get a little more involved? So initially it didn't change very much. But yeah, 2 years later, I'm definitely way more involved. So I think we have a great relationship, Sarah and I, and we have a great relationship when it comes to sports performance and sports medicine at Wake. So I think we're fortunate in that regard. But Sarah and I do our thing when it comes to PT and then the sports performance side. And we want to make sure that we're doing it for the best of the student athletes. And I think everyone else, sports performance and sports medicine, think the same thing. And then just recently was when it was changed again. So the title was then moved to Director of Sports Performance plus Return to Performance Coordinator.
Nice.
Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of what that looks like, maybe what it used to look like, and how the PT and strength and athletic trainers, like how that transition worked before? And then what sort of inspired the development of this type of return to performance coordination? And how was that kind of transition from what it used to be to what it currently is now? So I know that looks different at every university. A lot of universities don't have physical therapists in athletics at all. So could you talk a little bit about what that is at Wake?
Yeah. So even when I got there, it was new to me, because at Kentucky, we had a ton of athletic trainers and we had a physical therapist, but it wasn't like we had one that was dedicated to Olympic sports, nor did we, as far as I knew, I wasn't aware that we had one for football. And that was probably
there are no physical therapists in athletics at UK.
Yeah.
It's all ATs. And that's sort of a thing within the SEC. I know there's slight changes happening, but I think it is more adapted potentially in other conferences.
So it was definitely new to me. And once we kind of established that we wanted it to be a thing, I think it was just ultimately thinking about the experience the student athlete was getting. And Sarah was doing a great job with what she had and what time she had available, but she was just one person. So she was a PT for our entire Olympic sports, and we have only 13 Olympic sports. So at other universities, they've got a ton of Olympic sports. So I think we were fortunate enough that we don't have that many, but 13 sports is still a lot for one person to handle. So I think it was trying to prioritize the experience and make sure, while Sarah was for sure competent, well equipped to be able to do everything to get them back to whatever they needed to from a return to play standpoint, it just made way more sense for her time and then every other student athlete's time if we could essentially divide it amongst two. So initially, like I mentioned, we would just meet, and it was just kind of figuring out how do we communicate this and make sure everyone's on the same page, because I think that's the first step, making sure everyone's on the same page and making sure everyone has a good understanding of where that student athlete is and their return to performance or return to play process. And then after that, we established Sarah was going to take care of essentially everything in the training room. And that meant until they were ready to run, that Sarah was going to be like the main priority. That's in tandem with lifting. That's in tandem with doing everything else supplementary with their athletic trainer and their sports performance coach. But ultimately, if they're returning from an ACL tear, Sarah and what she wanted to do in the training room was going to be the priority, and everything else was complementary to that. And then there's testing along those lines. But after they tested well enough and they've checked these boxes, once they're ready to run, that's when they now can transition to our care for sports performance. We're able to take them out on the field. We're able to have them do some more functional things. And that, I think, helped quite a bit, not only from the student athlete just getting quality in terms of proper running mechanics, proper speed mechanics, what running's supposed to look like, but it also opened up Sarah's schedule a lot more. So she's not having to double or triple book student athletes as much. She's not having to have as long of days as she's having because she just had to stack people on top of people. So I think that was the main thought in mind after the student athlete experience. And now it's formed into very, very similar to what we just talked about in terms of Sarah's going to literally dictate and lead everything from a training room standpoint. And then once they're ready to get to the field and start to do more functional things, that's when they really transition to me. They start to see PT a little less. It might just be for 1 or 2 sessions just to clean up some things, but then their focus becomes how do they transition better to their sport? Because ultimately they're there as a student athlete and the sport is the most important thing to them. So I always emphasize with anyone that we bring on campus, our job is to make you the best student athlete and best athlete we can. And that's what our goal is, even more amplified once they get injured. We don't want to make them just the athlete they were before. We want to help them be better. And sometimes that does come at the consequence of an injury, but it's also a huge, huge learning experience and a good process for them to go through because they can get that individualized care from Sarah and the athletic trainer for X amount of weeks, X amount of months. And then the same thing from my end and our sports performance coaches, they get that individualized care. And I never would want it to come at the consequence of a student athlete in terms of being injured, but if that's what helps them get to the next level and help them honestly perform better after that, then I chalk that up as a win. So that's pretty much it. We look at it from like the surgeon's going to make all the decisions initially, and just for clearance purposes, the surgeon's going to decide everything. The athletic trainer is going to be involved throughout the entire process, whether that's they're just in the know or whether that's they're filling in the gaps in terms of supplementation. They're complementing what Sarah's doing. They're going to be in the know, same as our sports performance coaches, just because I work with volleyball and men's tennis. So we have a ton of sports that have long-term rehabs that I don't directly oversee. So it's important for me to make sure I communicate to them. And then once they start getting closer to their return to their sport, that's when they really do a lot less with myself, do a lot less with Sarah, and really transition back to their athletic trainer guiding them and progressing them back into their sport. And then their sports performance coach making sure they stay on top of load management, their strengthening, all the things that they still need to continue to work on to hopefully mitigate their risk of injury or re-injury.
Yeah. With you mentioned like testing that gets handled, you said on Sarah's end of the spectrum.
So we have kind of like a combination. We have all VOD products, and I guess minus our isokinetic machine. So we have a HUMAC in our training room, and then outside of that, we have all of our VOD products. So typically the first thing that's done is they'll test isometrically, and that might be on the dynamo, that might be on the isokinetic machine, but they're going to test isometrically, and they're going to do whatever testing they can in the weight room from a performance standpoint that won't inhibit their involved side or won't make their involved side painful or worse. So if they have any injury, we're trying to get them on our force frame as quickly as possible. When they are able to jump, we want to get them on our force decks as quick as possible. But those are things that we definitely go tandem or hand in hand with. So I'll be at testing. We had some individuals testing today, but if Sarah's doing some testing on the HUMAC or our isokinetic machine, then I'll be there. And that's kind of like the first stage to gauge where they're at and figure out what they need to improve at. And then she communicates that to me. And then after that, it's going to be probably more consistent testing in our weight room, on our force decks, on our force frame, on our Nord board, with our dynamo in between. And then probably another 4 to 8 weeks, Sarah will then again test on our HUMAC, see if we need to change anything, see if we need to fix any course of action. And then that's kind of how it rolls. All of our stuff is stationed in our weight room in terms of all of our VOD products. So even on our basketball side, even on our football side, they're always welcome to utilize that, and they do from a standpoint. But given the fact that we have all of our VOD products, we try to make sure everything is data informed and data driven. We're not always going to make decisions just simply based on the data, but we want to make sure that everything we're doing, we're testing, and we're having a purpose behind it. And hopefully the data supports it. And if it doesn't, then what can we do to kind of get that data or get them in the right spot that the data will reflect kind of how their progress is going.
Yeah.
So from an educational standpoint for the strength staff, so obviously a lot of the kind of like later stage rehab seems like it's, you said once they start running, they're kind of mostly handed off to strength with some supplemental from PT. Did you feel like there was a learning curve or a lot of education that needed to happen for the strength staff on how to kind of implement that later stage rehab, especially for people with different types of injuries? So I've seen sometimes where strength coaches just feel nervous to kind of work around injuries or don't necessarily know how to load it. So what does that look like from an educational standpoint?
Yeah, so it looks different for each of our sports. And I'll backtrack a little bit. It does look different for each of our sports. Our athletic trainers and our sports performance coaches are always going to be involved, and they're always going to be in the know. But from almost I guess liability is definitely the wrong word. I think essentially I would rather, if we don't have success with a student athlete, they come to me and it's just all my fault. Or if we do really well, then it's not necessarily all me, but it's one unified message that's coming from me. And it's kind of like I'm spearheading that. But again, our sports performance coaches are always involved. So with the running, yes, there was a learning curve, but I will say all of our running initially goes through me. So if we have a men's soccer player, then I'm doing their initial running progression. And then the only circumstances, if I'm not, are if I'm just absolutely booked and I can't make it work, or I feel very comfortable in the sense of that they're not really going to have any setbacks or any hurdles from a running mechanic standpoint, or probably a tolerance standpoint. So roughly I would say the first 4 to 6 or 8 weeks, they are running with me. And that's just kind of how we navigate, because if they have issues with me, then I can just communicate that to Sarah, and I can communicate that to their athletic trainer, our sport coaches, and all of that. But they're not hearing it from 3 different people, nor are they hearing 3 different messages. So while everyone's involved, it's kind of like Sarah and I are communicating things and then it's flowing through, but we try to make sure everyone's on the same page. And sometimes that comes as this person's leading it for quite some time and then they hand it off. So typically when I hand it off, it's when they're at very little risk for hopefully having any setbacks or any hurdles. So it's almost like they're still coming back from injury, but in my mind, they're not necessarily fearful of the injured site, because at that point they're hopefully running normally. They're running pretty well. They're doing more complex movements that are similar to their sport. So at that point, I'd hope we're not worried about how are they moving or how do they look. And if they do, then it's just a matter of, okay, let's figure out where we can make an adjustment. Let's figure out how we can kind of correct this and rebound from this. And sometimes that is just the education piece. Sometimes they have to take a step back and then it's back into PT and my hands, but it's definitely a fluid situation. There's some that are a little more involved than others, and I'm good with either. If you want it to be just more of, hey, tell me if you need anything from me, and that's it, then I'm good with that. If you want to be involved the entire time and you want to be at every session, you want to ask questions, you want to give input, I'm also good with that. I want it to be very much a collaborative approach. And I also acknowledge that if it's not a collaborative approach, then we won't have as much success. But with that collaborative approach, if I can be the person at fault, if something does go wrong, I'd rather that than them try to blame one of our other staff members. And it was just really me telling them what to do or me not setting them up for success.
So you're taking it on your shoulders.
Of course. That's the only way to do it.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I would rather someone yell at me. I would rather someone have an issue with something I've done.
Mm-hmm.
And then the people that are working with me learn from that versus someone else gets blamed and we start playing the blame game where at the end of the day, it was me leading it and guiding it. And then now two people are in trouble.
I'm sure the strength coaches appreciate that as well.
I hope they do. I think they do for sure. Yeah. I think they do.
Do you approach like the sports science side the same way? Because like you're talking about, you're doing a lot of vol testing and data interpretation. You know, who does that? Is that primarily something that's happening between you and the PT, or like is that dictating programming, or kind of how does that influence that coordination aspect as well?
It does. It informs it. I don't think we're at a good spot now where a lot of the procedures that we're seeing, we have a pretty good feel for how we want to attack it, how we want to start, how we want to progress it. And while everyone's situation is going to look a little different, being in this position now for going into year 3, there's a lot of commonalities. There's a lot of things that definitely overlap. So that helps. But yeah, definitely using a lot of the data, and it's important. So at Wake, I think we have a really good system where every person who comes in that's brand new, whether they're a transfer or just a freshman, we do baseline testing on them the first day they get there. So we have 5 tests we prioritize: counter movement jump, we do Nordboard, hip, AB, and adduction. We do, what else do? We do a drop jump, and then depending on kind of what their sport is, if they're an overhead athlete, we're going to test their shoulder internal, external rotation. So that's our starting point when they get onto campus, whether they're a grad student or they're a freshman. That's where we're going to get that information initially. And then it's very much dependent on whoever the coach is in terms of how frequent they test. But for me, being with volleyball, I prioritize our jump test quite a bit, and then I prioritize our shoulder testing quite a bit. So if we unfortunately have a volleyball player that has to have a labral repair, or she has to have a rotator cuff repair, or something along those lines, we already have that information. And that's something that Sarah's educated enough in as well, where she knows, okay, I see this information. I can do one of two things. I can either bring this to Knox's attention and he'll know what to do with it, or he can at least ask someone what we should do with it, or she'll just go ahead and make that correction in the training room herself and use that information. But we have a hub that everyone has access to, and everyone's really good, I think, about if they don't understand how to interpret a result, they ask. So we have a ton of data that we utilize, and there's definitely some tests that we utilize a little more with other teams, but it's definitely a strong part of our return to play progression. And it's something I like to utilize as early as if it's, again, an ACL tear, once they get out of their brace, we're trying to do squat assessments, and we're trying to do quiet stands on our force decks just to see really how much offloading they're doing on their involved side. So I communicate that to Sarah. She can then give me feedback on, hey, here's what we're working on in the training room. Can you retest them on their squat assessment? Or it's just something I'm going to do consistently, so that I know moving forward, okay, we might have to look at this later down the road. Even though they're looking great, even though they're getting stronger, they're still putting a decent amount of force through their uninvolved side and offloading pretty heavily and compensating. So it's not like we use it and it's law, because we've definitely had some student athletes that have looked sensational and exceptional, and their data has been just really, really poor. But on the flip side of that, we've had some athletes that have tested really, really well, and they're just really, really good when it comes to assessments. But from a functional standpoint and what they needed to do for their sport, it just didn't look very good. And we take both of those into consideration, because without one, you're still, in my opinion, going to put them at a pretty high risk of re-injury, because you're ignoring certain qualities that are going to end up coming up at some point.
I guess this is a little tangential, but like related to your testing thing. And you mentioned sometimes the data looks great and the person doesn't. athletically, or eye test, and then vice versa, the data looks not great. And so I think that's the trick of, like, obviously the data is a proxy, maybe a proxy of a proxy, or you could go like, is it turtles all the way down and just proxy of like how far are we going? So I guess in that process, is that then just like the collaboration with the team and trying to figure that out? That's a discussion, I'm assuming, with the athlete as well, and trying to tie all that in, or what does that look like for you guys? Or
Yeah, so we try to keep the student athlete, specifically for myself. I'll speak for myself, and I think this does represent how we do with our return to play process pretty heavily, but I'll speak for myself. I always try to keep the student athlete involved and informed in terms of things we're seeing both on the sports medicine side and sports performance side. And I do that for two reasons. One, I don't want them to be surprised if they were to hear it from secondarily from someone else. But two, I want them to feel like they're a part of the process and have an understanding of, maybe they've heard you should be able to run at 12 weeks or 16 weeks post ACL, but they're not there. So they're going to ask why, and they're going to want to know why. And if I can't provide any sound reasoning or logic behind that, then they're probably going to lose a little bit of trust in me and probably not buy into the process. So I always want to make sure the student athletes involved as much as they can. And it's their information. It's their return to play process. It's their data. So I really have nothing to hide anyways. Yep. But the more I can inform them and make them feel like they have an understanding of why it is they're progressing or why it isn't they're progressing, I feel like we've seen much better buy-in and much better results from that, because it's not a matter of second guessing. It's not a matter of doubt. It's now just essentially trusting the process and understanding, while it may not be going the way they originally thought it would or had planned, at least they're now understanding of why they're in the position they're in.
Are you ever going to a little, like, not like off script, but like, do you have like secondary measures that you have, like, if they're not moving well but they're passing these tests, consider these tests as well, or is that okay?
Yeah, so we have the major tests, and I think we have a few secondary tests, but with that, I think we've definitely tried to get away from almost ignoring test A, because we get a good result with test B. So then we just continue to move them forward. I think we prioritize test A. We keep in mind, okay, they're doing well with test B. And then we think about, why are they not doing well with test A? So one example I can think of is maybe their counter movement jump, or I guess it would be reversed with this, but say they're doing a counter movement jump, they're landing pretty evenly when it comes to right to versus left, and their peak landing force is pretty good. But you get them to do a single leg land and hold, or you get them to do a single leg jump, and then you see there's a massive deficit from side to side. I think that's something where, sure, they look great with the counter movement jump, but how often are our student athletes going to be on both legs? There's a ton of times where they're landing on one leg and landing on one limb, and there's a lot of unpredictability with a lot of sport. So we've got to make sure we take that into account. But in the same aspect, let's say their Nordboard testing looks great. They're strong. They're symmetrical. They look great when they're doing a Nordic, but when it comes to sprinting, they don't look well. They don't look good. That's one of those examples and instances where I'm then going to look at that and try to figure out, okay, their hamstrings seem to be strong enough, at least from a non-dynamic standpoint. Why is there this breakdown once we now add this ballistic and dynamic component to it, and try to figure that out? Some other things that we've looked at are, we've had some people that have really done well with isometric testing, and then for whatever reason, even after a full cycle or even after 2 cycles, they don't do well with isokinetic testing. And it's like, we could easily just continue to look at that and continue to isometrically test them, and we'd probably get sound results. And it's like, okay, let's progress, because you continue to get stronger isometrically and you feel good and you're doing well with these tests. But ultimately, if our isokinetic testing is our gold standard and what we want to prioritize from a testing clearance standpoint, then we need to figure out what it is that's holding them back from doing better on the isokinetic test than is showing what they're doing. Is it a pain tolerance? Is pain inhibiting them? Is it just something when it comes to the movement? Is their joint angle great with the isometric testing, but when you move them through different ranges of motion, that messes them up? I think that's probably a great example, because we have had some individuals that present really well isometrically their first test or their second test, and then the moment they get in our HUMAC, it's like, I would have never guessed that this is what the results would have been. And we just have to go back to the drawing board at that moment and figure out how we can set them up better for success moving forward, both with my area / sports medicine.
Yeah.
I know that this kind of ties in. I was going to ask this, like, you got your master's in sport and exercise psychology. How do you feel like that has changed the way that you kind of approach returning to sport after injury? Because that obviously the fear of getting back, and especially being student athletes, like the pressure of wanting to go back. And I find there's this balance between, trying to give someone all the information to tell them they're not ready, but you also don't want to scare people and make them feel like they're not doing well. So how kind of has your master's influenced the way that you communicate with patients, or how do you see that show up with your student athletes?
Yeah, I would honestly say a ton. And I think some people close to me might disagree with that just because I'm not the most emotional person. And there's times where I might lack a little bit of empathy, but I do think it's impacted the way I approach not only our return to play, but pretty much every training session, everything with my profession. It's impacted it a ton. But I think from the return to play standpoint, what I really, really validate and take into account a lot is, like you just said, the fear of avoidance, or just trying not to really mess up or get re-injured. And I think that's a very valid feeling. Even if they look great, they feel great, if they're not ready from a psychological standpoint, then I think that's just as important as all the data that we're getting. But on the flip side of that, how I present and how I articulate what it is I'm about to tell them is very, very much so thought through. So a lot of times I'll honestly have the conversation in my head before I even talk to the student athlete, because I want to make sure I present it in a positive, or more so productive light, understanding not everything's going to be positive and I can't be in their head to figure out how they're going to perceive it. But if I can do my best to at least paint it in a positive or productive manner, where maybe we start with, here's what they're doing well, here's where we need to improve, and here's how it's going to help us in the long run, then ultimately that's what I want to do. But it's helped quite a bit, because that's definitely not something I would have thought through before. I would have just thought, okay, I'm telling you it's good enough, you should just trust that. And I think that should be good enough for you. And on the flip side of it, I would have thought, okay, if I tell you the honest truth, no matter how I articulate it or how it's presented to you, you should appreciate that. Whereas I understand that's not everyone. And I think how student athletes perceive things is very, very realistic and very valid. Even if I don't agree with it, it's still their perception. So I always want to make sure I go into those conversations, not only with our student athletes, but our sport coaches as well. And not that I have something prepped, but definitely know, okay, here's how I would like to paint it, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, that this isn't a tragic event or this isn't tragedy. This is something that we can improve on. This is something that's productive. And even if it's the worst news, I still want to try to figure out, okay, I don't want to lie, I don't want to misguide them, but how can I make this to where it's not as devastating to them as if I were just to simply say, hey, here's what we have. You just got to accept it. So I definitely think it's helped quite a bit with those conversations. And just specifically like the readings, the classes that we took, I would have never imagined it would have impacted this portion the way it has, but it really has impacted it quite a bit.
Definitely. I feel like too, I mean, you work with specific teams, so I feel like you have the benefit of getting to probably know a lot of the individuals before they get injured. I see people and it's like, I don't know them at all. Yeah. And so you sort of have to get to know them and then potentially figure out how that individual likes to receive information. Some people need tough love and some people need, a lot of positive reinforcement.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you see any differences like between like your male and female athletes, like the way that you approach them, or is it just like a very individualistic approach and you don't really see? I would work with football, and that's probably a whole different beast than working with tennis and volleyball. So it's probably sports specific as well.
It's definitely very individualistic. And I think that was because, like you said, I definitely think you have individuals that prefer to be a little more positive, and then you have individuals that prefer tough love and they just want to hear how it is. But even when I got to the next step, I was assuming, similar to what you mentioned, okay, this sport is going to be able to do the tough love. This sport is going to be able to do more positive, and that's just how I'm going to have to be. But it's even more finite than that. It's definitely very individualized. And that's why I think the part that I really try to prioritize is getting to know all of our student athletes. And even 4.5 years later, I still try to assist with as many teams as we can. And it's one, because I enjoy what I do. Two, because I love building the relationships I can with our student athletes and our staff. But three, also, worst case scenario, I've now hopefully built a pre-existing relationship with our student athlete that just tore their ACL, or I now have a pre-existing relationship with the athlete that just got Tommy John surgery. And it's not, I'm starting from square one or starting at block zero when I meet them, or when they're the day after surgery. We already have that rapport. We already have that relationship. And I kind of know how we're going to approach the situation. But even then, there's ups and downs. There's going to be weeks where what we normally do isn't going to work, and it's just because it's that type of week. Or there's weeks where you would think that they just won the lottery because of how happy they're at, and I try to maximize those weeks, but it's definitely individualized, and I definitely try my best to prioritize getting to know all of our student athletes well before they run into the long-term injury, because I do acknowledge that meeting someone that you've never met for the first time, it's much harder to build a relationship and rapport. And from just a relationship standpoint, and even like being able to periodize for them, being able to write workouts for them and make sure you're setting them up well, that's helped out quite a bit, because there's some athletes I know don't respond well to this type of squat, or there's some athletes that I know have not been receptive to this type of exercise. And it's something that even without having that conversation, I can go ahead and create their program that best suits them and best fits them, but still also meets whatever the needs are for them. So it's definitely very much individualized, and it's definitely been a learning moment. Even in year 3, I'm still figuring out things and learning how to do things, because we do have a ton of people that are a little, I guess, more emotional than I might be used to. And it's not their fault. It's not a fault of theirs. It's just something I have to get used to. And I have to figure out how to now make this situation the best for them.
Yeah.
Yep. You'll probably be learning for the rest of your career.
Exactly.
So also, like, every generation brings new personalities.
That's definitely been a learning moment. And
we're all crashing out, you know.
No, I would love to have any type of conversation with anyone who disagrees when they say it's not a generational thing, because
I work a lot with young high schoolers, and I'm like, they are so sweet, but it's just what they say and the way that they interact and do things. It's different. It's similar. Different. But it's different. So
there's similarities, but a lot of it is different.
Yeah.
It is interesting. They keep you young.
They do. They keep me young, but they also remind me now how old I'm getting.
Oh yeah.
And I'm not one that likes to play with that. So it's like, gosh, I love this. I love meeting new people. I love that we get new freshmen in every year. I love that we get to do this every single day. But hearing that I'm working with someone born in 2006, it's like, oh, how old are you? Not 2000s, I can assure you of that. So we'll just not talk about it now. But they keep you young but old at the same time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But as long as you can beat them in a sprint race, then you can put them in their place.
No, I make it very evident that we're going to set some boundaries right now.
Once we get to late stage plyos, I'm like, I can't demonstrate a lot of this stuff. I'm going to just tell you what to do, and then you're going to do it. Otherwise, I'm going to hurt myself. So.
I think that's something I learned, but I also pride myself on in trying to make sure that no matter what it is I'm asking them to do, I need to be able to demonstrate it, and I want to be able to demonstrate it at a high level. Just if there was the off week where there might be a little snapback of, you're asking me to do this, why don't you do it? So then I can just make sure I do it, let them know, okay, that's fine. And then, hey, can we move on?
I'm going to ask, because I'm curious. I have never worked really directly in collegiate athletics. I've worked primarily with high school age athletes. And in that scenario, we deal a lot with parents. We deal a little bit lesser with coaches because they're more in the periphery of the rehab process. Are the coaches more like the parents in this situation, or do you also have parents that you are factoring into the equation, especially when we're talking about maybe like pressure to get an athlete back quickly? Who is that pressure potentially coming from, and what does that look like in kind of like a higher level college setting?
Yeah, both are definitely involved. In terms of pressure, it's definitely going to be the sport coaches, but both are involved. I will say thankful for our sports medicine staff because they're typically the ones that are dealing with the parents more so. It's definitely less frequent that I'm involved and the parents are wanting kind of like an entire meeting with our interdisciplinary team. So that's fortunate for me. The coaches are definitely more of who I'm speaking with and who I'm entertaining, because there is that pressure of, especially if it's one of their better student athletes, of how quickly can we get them back. And I do think we've done a pretty good job with all of our student athletes of not letting that dictate things. I think it certainly influences it to an extent, because at the end of the day, they're here to play their sport. They're just as motivated as their coaches are wanting them to be back. So the student athlete kind of jumps on the coach's back and is like, yeah, I agree with them. I agree with he or her or whatever they're saying. So I think it influences it just a little bit. But at the end of the day, if we have this person who is 8 months post-op from an ACL, but they look pretty good, but they're just not ready from a change of direction standpoint, or they're just not grasping a certain skill that they need to grasp, then we're not going to put them out there. We're not going to let any amount of pressure from a sport coach influence that. But they definitely have input because, again, at the end of the day, it's the student athlete that they decided to bring on campus. And I think they're inclined and they're deserving to have those questions and have those conversations, because we wouldn't be working with the student athlete if it weren't for them. But I do also acknowledge it's not always, from the coaching standpoint, it might not always be that they're just asking because they want them back. They might just be curious. And that is something I also had to learn, where I can remember when I first started taking it a little more personally if a sport coach asked, well, how soon until they're back playing? And it was just like a question versus they're trying to get them back next week. And now I figured that out. And now it's just a matter of either or. If they are upset that they're not back, I'm going to have the same conversation as if they're just being curious, because I'm not going to let their pressure impact what it is that we're doing. At the end of the day, when they're ready, they're going to be ready. And if that's soon enough for the coach, then great. If it's not soon enough for the coach, then we're still going to do our due diligence and make sure that the student athlete has the best and most positive experience they can have before they get put back on the field or on the court.
In the whole return to play, obviously in the longer term stuff, like kids might be going home for summer. Is that something you're having to deal with, like coordinating with external rehab situations?
Yeah, it's my least favorite time of the year. So it's my least favorite time of the year because it makes things way more challenging. Yeah. And I admittedly do really, really well with the student athletes we have on campus, and then not as well with the student athletes we don't have on campus. And I feel terrible for it when we get student athletes that send me a text 1 week later and they're like, hey, Knox, I didn't see you put any workouts for here, or I haven't gotten any runs from you in a few days. And it's like, I need to be better about that, but it's my least favorite time of the year. Typically, again, fortunate enough for me, I don't have to coordinate that as much, unless they're working with maybe like a specific coach or they're trying to go to a specific facility, then I might check into that for them. But when it comes to PT, what we try to do, and I know what Sarah and our athletic trainers try to do, is set them up with a sports PT, and then ideally set them up with a sports PT that has a really good setup from a training standpoint, so they can essentially check both boxes at the same location. And at times it's worked out really, really good. And at times it's been better than nothing, which I appreciate a lot. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely, even our student athletes will acknowledge, it's not the same experience they get. And I think they appreciate the environment, the experience that we offer when they're on campus. And they acknowledge that when they're away, it's not like, okay, we're neglecting them. They just know it's not possible to replicate what we do on campus when they're offsite or when they're traveling. And not to mention, a ton of them have internships, so their schedule varies drastically. They're traveling. There's all these other factors that go into it as well that kind of redirect their progress and redirect their rehab. So it just becomes harder. It's not, for me, it's not an excuse not to do my job. I don't do as well, but I also acknowledge that at the end of the day, we've got to make sure that we set them up as best as we can. And I try to do that, but I also know there's going to be challenges every time they leave for the summer or even winter break. Every time they leave, we're probably not going to get the same product we got once they left.
Yeah.
Very true. Well, we are getting close to the 45-minute mark, which is typically where we try to cut it. But I'm going to ask, if you could go back and tell young Knox some pieces of advice from yourself, kind of like to inspire the students that might be listening, what would you tell yourself?
What would I tell myself?
Mm-hmm.
One that I always tell myself, and it's been more recent, but I've definitely adopted it. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. And in this role, it's very much backed by evidence and very much backed by science. But what worked for student athlete A may not work for student athlete B. And if that is the case, then to me, that's not necessarily a mistake. It's just something that gives you feedback and you can learn from that. So I think acknowledging that things aren't always going to go perfectly and things aren't always going to go how you plan them to, but it's not something to get discouraged by, and it's something to just make sure you learn from. The other piece I would say is just make sure you do like as much as you can in whatever it is you're interested. So for me, for instance, I do enjoy athletic training, and that's what I started in, and I have my certification and I'm licensed, but I also would have never gotten to strength conditioning if I hadn't experienced that and branched out. And then same thing with psychology. I didn't know necessarily how much of an interest it was until I took a class in undergrad, and knowing how much it helped me now based on my master's, I would definitely encourage every younger individual or every person who's coming up in their career and their profession to try and branch out and explore as many domains as they can. And I'm fortunate at Wake where I'm able to chat with our sports medicine staff frequently and bounce ideas off their head and learn from them. I've been fortunate at the other places I've been as well, where it's been a very similar environment and I've been able to learn a lot. And I think it's helped me get to this point to where it's not just Knox is a strength conditioning coach that works with student athletes that are injured. He has a diverse background and he has a well-versed background that he can efficiently and productively help these student athletes. And if he doesn't know something, then he's going to make sure he does whatever he can to get that best answer, or at least a suitable answer, an appropriate answer for whoever it is.
I love that. I think students especially are very afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah.
When you get out in the real world, you realize things are very gray, and it gets
Absolutely
a while to get comfortable with that. But, well, could you tell the listeners if they want to reach out to you, follow you on social media, like where can they follow Ken Knox?
Yeah, so if they want to follow me on Instagram, that's pretty much the only thing I'm really active on. It's the Ken Knox, just spelled out the Ken Knox, simple. And then if they want to reach me, more than welcome to take emails. My email is Knox, last name T@wfu.edu. But I'm also the first to admit I'm not great when it comes to my phone or replying to emails in a quick manner. I'm roughly at my desk at the beginning of the day and end of the day. So there's a good chance that if you need a response quickly, email is not going to be the way to do it. But if you can wait a day or two, then definitely send me an email and I'll be happy to get back to you.
There you go. We super appreciate your time. You're sharing your expertise. It was great. And thanks for everyone for checking us out live or later.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Absolutely, man. It's great
Love
having
chatting.
you on. Yeah.
We'll see if this turns off or not.